On a freezing December morning in 1943, just 4 days before Christmas, 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charles Brown from West Virginia sat in the cockpit of his B-17 bomber Olde Pub. Certain he was about to die, blood soaking through his leather flight jacket from a shrapnel wound in his shoulder, the aircraft's nose cone completely blown away, exposing the crew to -60-degree air that screamed through the fuselage like a banshee's wail. One engine dead and trailing black. Smoke, another sputtering and threatening to quit. The third producing barely half power. Hydraulic fluid spraying across shattered instruments and twisted metal. The electrical system sparking and dying. Oxygen lines ruptured and hissing uselessly. The tail section so riddled with hundreds of bullet holes it looked like someone had taken a giant cheese grater to the aluminum skin. His tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode slumped dead in his turret with blood frozen to his young face. Several other crew members wounded and barely conscious as they tried desperately to bandage each other with fingers so numb from cold they could barely grip the gauze. The bomber's defensive guns reduced from 11 to just 3 still capable of firing. And through the chaos and pain and terror, Brown could see German Messerschmitt fighters circling in the distance like vultures waiting for the final kill, having just finished a devastating attack during their bombing run over Bremen that left the flying fortress so catastrophically damaged that by all laws of physics and aerodynamics it should have already plummeted into the frozen German countryside thousands of feet below. The mission to destroy the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory having turned into a nightmare when accurate anti-aircraft flak knocked them out of formation before they even reached the target, making them easy prey for wave after wave of German fighters who attacked with such ferocity for more than 10 agonizing minutes that Brown had actually lost consciousness from blood loss and oxygen deprivation, sending the bomber into a death spiral that he somehow miraculously woke from just seconds before impact, pulling out of the dive so close to the ground he could see individual trees and farmhouses, and now as he struggled to keep the shattered bomber level at barely 1,000 feet, flying at only 135 miles per hour when the aircraft needed 160 just to stay airborne safely, too low and too slow and too damaged to possibly escape back across the North Sea to England, having already accepted that his first mission as an aircraft commander would be his last, that he would never see his mother again, never walk the hills of West Virginia, never grow old or have children or experience anything beyond this frozen hell, and then, as if the universe wanted to confirm his darkest fears one final time, a German fighter suddenly appeared alongside the crippled bomber, so close that Brown could see the black crosses on its wings, see the pilot's leather helmet and goggles, see the guns pointed directly at what remained of his aircraft, close enough that Brown knew with absolute certainty that in the next few seconds those guns would fire and end everything. But then something impossible happened, something that defied every rule of warfare, every expectation of combat, every bitter hatred that 4 years of global carnage had bred into millions of hearts. The German pilot, 28-year-old Luftwaffe ace Franz Stigler from Regensburg, Bavaria, a former airline pilot who had been fighting since the war began and had already shot down 27 Allied aircraft including 2 B-17 bombers just that very morning, needing only one more kill to earn the Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's highest military honor, a medal that would bring glory and recognition and proof that his brother's death as a night fighter pilot in 1940 had meaning, looked through the torn and shredded fuselage of the American bomber at the boys inside trying desperately to save each other, saw the pilot covered in blood struggling with controls that barely responded, saw wounded crew members attempting to render first aid with frozen morphine syringes that were useless, saw the headless body of the tail gunner still slumped in position, saw young men who could have been his students when he was a flight instructor, who looked exactly like the airmen he had watched parachute from burning planes over North Africa, and in that crystallizing moment Franz Stigler remembered the words of his commanding officer Gustav Rodel who had told him years earlier, his voice stern and uncompromising, "If I ever see or hear of any of you shooting at someone in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." And as Stigler stared at the helpless bomber, he thought to himself that these men were essentially in a parachute already. They were defenseless and wounded and barely alive, and killing them would not be combat but murder, cold-blooded execution of men who could no longer fight back, and so Franz Stigler, fully aware that what he was about to do could result in his court-martial and execution, which was the certain penalty for allowing an enemy bomber to escape during active combat, made a decision that would echo across the decades and change 2 lives forever. He pulled his trembling finger away from the trigger, touched the rosary beads he always carried as his talisman, and instead of unleashing the burst of cannon fire that would have shredded the B-17 and earned him his medal, He began to fly escort, actually protecting his enemy, pulling up alongside close enough that the terrified American crew could see him making urgent gestures, pointing emphatically, trying desperately to communicate through hand signals that they should turn and land at a German airfield where they would receive medical treatment and survive as prisoners of war, or that they should head northeast toward neutral Sweden, which was close enough to reach and where they would be interned but alive. But Charlie Brown, not understanding the frantic gestures, thinking this might be some sadistic game before the final kill, some psychological torture before death, kept the battered bomber pointed north toward England even though every rational calculation said they would never make it, even though the North Sea stretched before them like an endless frozen grave 250 miles wide, even though fuel was leaking, engines were failing, and wounded men were going into shock. But Franz Stigler understood the stubborn courage, this absolute refusal to surrender even when surrender was the only logical choice, and he respected it, so he stayed with them, maintained close formation on the bomber's left side, so close that his fighter's wingtip was only 3 feet from the B-17's shattered wing, close enough that German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground looking up would see the Luftwaffe fighter flying in formation and hold their fire, believing this was a captured American bomber being escorted by their own forces or some kind of special German operation. And so for long surreal minutes they flew together across the German countryside. This impossible formation of mortal enemies transformed into reluctant brothers, Brown at one point ordering his top turret gunner to train the guns on Stigler as a warning to back off, and Stigler seeing the gesture but staying steady, absolutely determined to see this through even if it cost him everything. Flying with them across the most heavily defended territory in Europe, where a single radio call from a ground observer reporting his tail number would mean certain death, until finally they crossed the coastline and flew out over the cold gray waters of the North Sea where the waves churned and broke in patterns of white foam that looked from altitude like the scattered bones of all the men who had died in this war, and only then, only when he was absolutely certain the Americans were safely beyond German airspace and beyond the range of coastal defenses, did Franz Stigler slide his Messerschmitt close one final time, so close that Charlie Brown could clearly see the enemy pilot's face, see his eyes, and then Stigler slowly raised his gloved hand in a salute, not the Nazi salute but a simple gesture of respect from one warrior to another, a silent acknowledgement of shared humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter before banking his fighter away in a steep turn and disappearing back toward Germany. Back toward a secret he would have to guard with his life because speaking of such mercy to anyone would mean execution, while Charlie Brown, stunned and disbelieving, somehow managed to nurse the dying bomber across 250 miles of open water, the crew taking turns at the controls as Brown drifted in and out of consciousness, the aircraft losing altitude the entire way, wings shuddering and threatening to break off, engines coughing and sputtering one by one until they had only a single power plant keeping them aloft, fuel gauges reading empty, hydraulics completely gone, meaning no brakes or flaps for landing, and then miraculously, impossibly, through a combination of skill and desperation and divine intervention, they spotted the coast of England through breaks in the clouds, and Brown managed to crash-land the bomber at RAF Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group, the aircraft hitting the runway so hard that parts flew off in all directions, sliding and skidding with sparks flying until it finally lurched to a stop, and the ground crew who rushed to the scene stood absolutely dumbfounded, because they had never seen an aircraft so catastrophically damaged still capable of flight. Maintenance officers counted over 400 bullet and shrapnel holes, found entire sections of wing and fuselage held together by nothing but rivets and prayers, discovered that the rudder was nearly shot away, that control cables were hanging by threads, that one wrong gust of wind or one more hit would have sent the entire aircraft tumbling from the sky, and when Charlie Brown stumbled out of the cockpit during his debriefing, when he told the intelligence officers about the German pilot who had not only spared them but actually protected them and escorted them to safety, he was immediately ordered never to speak of it again, told in no uncertain terms that someone decided you can't be human and be flying in a German cockpit, told that such stories would create positive sentiment about the enemy which could not be tolerated when they needed every pilot angry and motivated to kill, and so both men carried their secret through the remainder of the war. Franz Stigler saying nothing because revelation meant a firing squad, Charlie Brown saying nothing because he had received direct orders to remain silent. And the months turned to years, the war finally ended. In May 1945, with Europe in ruins and millions dead and entire cities reduced to smoking rubble, both men returned to civilian life forever changed by what they had experienced, Stigler eventually emigrating to Vancouver, Canada in 1953 to start fresh in a new world far from the memories and ashes of Germany, working his way up to become a successful businessman while the nightmares of war slowly faded but never completely disappeared, while Brown returned to West Virginia, completed his education, rejoined the Air Force in 1949 and served until 1965, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Then worked as a State Department Foreign Service officer traveling to Laos and Vietnam where new wars raged, and finally retired to Miami in 1972 to pursue his passion for invention. But he never forgot that frozen December day. The memory of the German pilot who spared him haunted his dreams for decades, appearing in quiet moments when he least expected it, and finally in 1986, more than 40 years after the incident, while speaking at a combat pilot reunion called Gathering of the Eagles at Maxwell Air Force Base when someone asked if he had any memorable missions, Charlie Brown decided the time had come to find the man who had saved his life, even though he had almost nothing to go on, no name, no unit number, just the memory of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, a hand raised in salute, and an act of mercy. That seemed impossible, and so he began searching with the determination of a man on a mission, writing hundreds of letters to German Air Force veterans organizations, contacting military archives in both America and Germany, placing notices in newsletters for former Luftwaffe pilots, following leads that went nowhere, hitting dead ends month after month, year after year, and the fear grew that the German pilot had died in the final desperate months of the war when Germany threw everything into the fight, or had been killed in the post-war chaos, or had simply passed away in the decades since, until finally in January 1990, after 4 long years of searching, a letter arrived at Brown's home in Miami postmarked from Vancouver, Canada, and the moment Charlie Brown opened the envelope and saw the words, "I was the one," written in neat script, his hands began to shake so badly he could barely hold the paper, and when they spoke on the phone for the first time, Franz Stigler described everything in perfect detail: the damage to the bomber's nose, the missing elevator, the dead tail gunner, his decision to spare them, his escort across Germany, the salute. Describing details that Brown had never mentioned in any of his search notices, details that only the German pilot who was actually there could possibly know, and both men wept openly as 46 years of separation and silence and wondering finally ended, and they realized with astonishment that they had been living less than 200 miles apart for much of the time since the war, strangers who were brothers separated by circumstance and fear and the burden of secrets that could not be shared. And when they finally met in person in Seattle in 1990, it was as if a missing piece of each man's soul suddenly clicked back into place. Franz embraced Charlie and said through tears, "I love you, Charlie Brown." And Brown, who had suffered nightmares about the war for 47 years, found that after meeting Stigler the nightmares stopped, the crushing weight of survivors' guilt lifted, peace became possible for the first time since 1943, and Stigler, who had lost his brother and watched so many friends die in burning aircraft, who had been called a traitor by some Germans for leaving the fatherland and shunned as a Nazi by some Canadians who could never understand the complexity of his experience, who had been haunted for decades by the question of whether his moment of compassion had been weakness or the truest expression of strength, found in Charlie Brown the validation that his choice had been right, that there had been profound meaning in his mercy, that even in the darkest depths of humanity's worst war it was possible to remain human. And for the next 18 years these two old warriors, former mortal enemies who had once existed only to kill each other, became the closest of friends, visiting regularly, fishing together, sharing meals, speaking at military reunions and high schools and universities, appearing together in documentaries and interviews, collaborating on a book that would preserve their story for future generations, teaching anyone who would listen that even in war, honor and humanity need not die, that the bonds of compassion can transcend the deepest divisions of nation and ideology and hatred. And then in 2008, as if their spirits were still connected by that frozen moment over Germany 65 years before, as if they had become so intertwined that one could not exist without the other, Charlie Brown died on November 24th at age 86 and Franz Stigler followed him into whatever lies beyond on March 22nd at age 92, passing away within just 4 months of each other, their friendship having given both men the healing they desperately needed for half a century, having proved beyond any doubt that the bonds of shared humanity can transcend the deepest divisions that war creates. And today their story stands as an eternal testament to the truth that in our darkest hours, in our moments of greatest hatred and fear and violence, we still retain the power to choose. We can still choose mercy over murder, compassion over cruelty, brotherhood over enmity, life over death. That even when the world demands we see only enemies deserving of destruction, we can choose to see human beings deserving of dignity. That sometimes the greatest act of courage is not pulling the trigger but refusing to pull it, not destroying but protecting, not killing but saving, and that single choice, made in the frozen sky over Germany on a December day 4 days before Christmas in 1943, reverberates still across the decades, a reminder that the most powerful weapon we possess is not the machines of war but the compassion in our hearts, that the greatest honor we can achieve is not the medals we earn for killing but the lives we save by refusing to kill, by seeing not targets but brothers, not enemies but fellow human beings struggling to survive, in circumstances beyond their control, and that simple recognition, that moment of empathy across the battle lines, can change everything, can stop the finger on the trigger, can turn an enemy into a guardian, can transform a day of death into a lifetime of friendship, can teach generations yet unborn that within each of us, no matter how dark the night or desperate the hour or overwhelming the pressure to hate, there burns an inextinguishable light, the light of our common humanity, waiting only for the courage to let it shine. And Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, two men who should have been eternal enemies, who should have killed each other without hesitation or regret, instead became living proof that even in war, even in the midst of mechanized slaughter and industrial-scale death, the human heart can still choose love, can still recognize the sacred in the other, can still honor the warrior's code. That says some things matter more than victory, that mercy matters, that compassion matters, that the man in your gun sight is somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's friend, and that killing him when he is helpless and wounded would not be combat but murder. And Franz Stigler refused to become a murderer even when it would have been so easy, even when it would have earned him glory, even when every rule of war said he should pull the trigger, because in that moment he understood with perfect clarity that the enemy is not the man but the war itself, that the true victory is not in how many we kill but in how much of our humanity we preserve, and that lesson, learned in fire and blood and frozen air 6 miles above a devastated continent, remains as vital today as it was 80 years ago, a reminder that we are more than our worst impulses, more than our capacity for violence, more than the hatred we are taught, that we are also capable of extraordinary grace, of seeing clearly in the fog of war, of choosing life when ordered to deal death, of remaining human when everything conspires to make us monsters, and perhaps that is the ultimate meaning of the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown. Not just that mercy is possible in war, but that mercy is essential, that without it we lose not just battles but ourselves, that the preservation of our humanity matters more than the destruction of our enemies, and that sometimes, in the most unlikely moments and the most impossible circumstances, two men who should have been killers can instead become saviors. Two hearts hardened by war can still recognize each other's humanity. Two lives marked by violence can still choose peace, and in that choice, made alone in the sky with no witnesses and no reward, with everything to lose and nothing to gain except the quiet knowledge of having done the right thing, Franz Stigler saved not just 9 American lives but the soul of humanity itself, proved that even in the worst of us there remains the best of us, that even in the darkest chapter of human history when evil seemed ascendant and compassion seemed extinct, ordinary men could still perform extraordinary acts of grace. And that is why this story, this Christmas miracle over Germany, this impossible meeting of mercy and warfare, continues to matter, continues to inspire, continues to remind us that redemption is always possible, that healing is always possible, that peace is always possible, that we are the authors of our own choices and the architects of our own humanity, and that the legacy we leave is not measured in victories won or enemies destroyed but in moments when we chose compassion over cruelty, when we saw the humanity in those we were taught to hate, when we became, against all odds and all expectations, not instruments of death but ambassadors of life. And Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, 2 old men who wept in each other's arms decades after they should have killed each other, are the eternal proof that even the deepest wounds of war can heal, even the most bitter enemies can become brothers, even the darkest night can give way to dawn, and that the human capacity for mercy, for forgiveness, for love, is stronger than any weapon, more enduring than any empire, more powerful than any force that seeks to divide us, because in the end, when all the battles are forgotten and all the medals have turned to dust, what remains is the choice we made when no one was watching, the moment we saw our enemy as ourselves, the instant we chose to save rather than destroy, and in that choice, in that single act of defiance against the machinery of war, in that refusal to become what war demanded we become, lies our salvation and our hope and our future, the promise that humanity, battered and bloodied and tested beyond endurance, can still choose love over hate, life over death, mercy over vengeance, and in doing so can still find its way home.